For over 1,000 years, civilization flourished across the Mediterranean and the Near East, reaching heights of power and sophistication never before seen. The Late Bronze Age was a time of astonishing achievements. Monumental architecture, complex trade networks, advanced metallurgy, and the first great written languages. It was an era of kings and warriors, of vast palaces and sprawling cities, of diplomacy and wealth built on long-distance commerce. But beneath this golden age lay a fragile balance, one that would one day break, bringing an entire world crashing down. To understand why this collapse occurred, we must first understand what made this civilization so powerful in the first place. The Bronze Age itself was named after the metal that defined it. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder, more durable, and more versatile than the stone or simple copper tools that had come before it. It was the foundation of progress used for everything: tools, weapons, armor, agricultural equipment, chariots, and even religious artifacts. But there was a fundamental problem. Tin was rare. Unlike copper, which could be found in multiple regions, tin deposits were scarce and scattered, with the most significant sources located in distant lands such as Central Asia, the British Isles, and parts of Spain. Civilizations that wished to thrive in the Bronze Age had no choice but to secure and maintain vast trade routes to keep the supply of tin flowing. Without tin, there was no bronze, and without bronze, there was no progress. At the heart of this interconnected world were the great civilizations that ruled the lands from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. In the west, the Mycenaeans ruled over what would later become Greece, constructing massive palaces atop fortified citadels. They were warriors, seafarers, and traders navigating the Mediterranean to acquire gold, ivory, and exotic goods. To their east, the Hittites controlled an empire that stretched across Anatolia, using their advanced military and political power to become one of the dominant forces of the Late Bronze Age. Further south, the Egyptian Empire stood as the pinnacle of wealth and stability, its vast territories along the Nile providing abundant food and resources. The Babylonians, masters of astronomy and mathematics, ruled over one of the world's oldest civilizations, while the Assyrians, still rising in power, built their strength on military innovation. The Minoans, an earlier civilization centered on Crete, had already left their mark on history with their advanced cities and extensive trade networks. But none of these great powers stood alone. Their might was not built on conquest alone, but on a vast web of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. The city of Ugarit, located on the coast of what is now Syria, was a critical hub that linked the great empires of the age. Ships from Mycenae, Egypt, and the Levant crowded its harbors, carrying precious cargoes of gold, silver, copper, tin, and luxury goods such as textiles and exotic spices. Goods from as far as Afghanistan, Spain, and the British Isles passed through its markets, feeding the ever-growing economies of the Bronze Age kingdoms. Writing had also become essential to governance and diplomacy. The Hittites recorded their treaties, laws, and royal decrees using cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay tablets first developed in Mesopotamia. The Mycenaeans developed Linear B, an early form of Greek script used for administrative purposes, keeping track of palace inventories, land ownership, and economic transactions. Egyptian hieroglyphs adorned the temples of pharaohs, immortalizing their victories and divine legitimacy. This was the first truly international world connected by language, commerce, and diplomacy. But beneath the surface, this world was vulnerable. The very systems that had made the Late Bronze Age so prosperous. International trade, complex bureaucracy, and reliance on rare resources created deep dependencies. The ruling classes controlled vast economies that relied on consistent agricultural yields, steady trade, and stable governance. The great empires had not built themselves to withstand catastrophic disruption. They had built themselves for stability. For generations, it seemed as though civilization could only grow stronger. But then, suddenly, it didn't. Across the Mediterranean and Near East, the first cracks began to form. Cities that had flourished for centuries were abandoned. The trade routes that had bound civilizations together collapsed. The mighty kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age fell one by one, their once great palaces reduced to rubble. How could such a vast and powerful world fall apart so completely? What forces could have caused an age of kings, chariots, and great cities to vanish into dust? To answer that, we must trace the first warning signs, the subtle changes that signaled that the world as they knew it was beginning to fall apart. The fall of the Bronze Age was not a single event. It was not one great war, nor a singular disaster, nor a sudden act of destruction. It was a slow unraveling, a series of cascading failures that built upon one another. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Shortages of key goods, shifts in power, rumors of unrest. Then, city by city, the lights of civilization began to go out. In the Aegean, the mighty Mycenaean civilization, once the dominant power of the Greek world, began to unravel. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Pylos, Thebes and Mycenae itself reveal layers of destruction. Burned ruins, abandoned palaces and evidence of mass migration. These cities, once fortified bastions of trade and warfare, were suddenly and violently destroyed. But why? Were they attacked, or did something else drive them to collapse from within? Further east, the Hittite Empire met an even more devastating fate. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, was abandoned so completely that its location was forgotten for centuries. When archaeologists finally uncovered it in the 20th century, they found clear signs of sudden destruction. Buildings reduced to ash, royal records left unfinished, entire districts eerily deserted. Letters from the final years of the empire show a desperate attempt by Hittite kings to hold their crumbling kingdom together, pleading for grain shipments and struggling to maintain control over rebellious vassal states. But their empire, once one of the great powers of the Bronze Age, simply ceased to exist. Babylon, which had withstood centuries of war and upheaval, fell into chaos. The Cascade dynasty, which had ruled over the city for more than 400 years, was overthrown. The Elamites, a lesser-known power from the Iranian plateau, invaded and sacked the city, stripping it of its treasures and reducing its influence. The once mighty city, famous for its towering ziggurats and vast libraries, became a shadow of its former self. And then there was Ugarit, the jewel of the Levant. In its final days, its last king, Amurapi, sent a desperate letter to his allies, warning of enemy ships appearing on the horizon. It was a plea for help, one that was never answered. The city was destroyed so suddenly that its clay tablets, still drying in the sun, were baked solid by the fires that consumed it. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins, they found streets frozen in time, abandoned workshops, half-eaten meals, lives that had been abruptly ended. Trade, the lifeline of the Bronze Age world, collapsed. The ships that had once carried goods across the Mediterranean vanished from the seas. The tin that had once made bronze weapons and tools began to run out. In some regions, metallurgy regressed. Artisans, unable to obtain bronze, resorted to making weapons from inferior materials. Without resources, armies weakened. Without armies, cities became vulnerable. This collapse of trade was not gradual. It was devastating. The Mediterranean economy imploded. Cities that had once been part of an intricate web of commerce and diplomacy found themselves cut off, isolated, struggling to survive. The palaces of the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Babylonians had been built on the assumption of endless trade and prosperity. When that assumption failed, their world crumbled with it. But this was only the beginning. Something far more terrifying was about to arrive. An enemy that no one had seen before, one that would leave a path of destruction unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. The Sea Peoples had arrived, and with them the final chapter of the Bronze Age was about to be written. They came from the sea. That much is certain, so. Beyond that, almost everything about them remains a mystery. Their origins, their motivations, and even their ultimate fate, shrouded in uncertainty. To the ancient Egyptians, they were simply known as the Sea Peoples, an ominous and vague term, but the destruction they left in their wake was all too real. For the civilizations of the late Bronze Age, the arrival of the Sea Peoples was not just another war. It was a catastrophe. Unlike previous invaders who sought conquest and control, the Sea Peoples appeared as a force of pure destruction. City after city fell to their relentless attacks. Coastal settlements were wiped out, their harbours set ablaze, their palaces reduced to rubble. The great trade networks of the Mediterranean, already faltering, were further crippled as the very ships that once carried precious cargoes across the seas were now repurposed for war and piracy. The Egyptians recorded their battles against these mysterious invaders on the walls of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramses III. The reliefs depict chaotic scenes of naval combat. Egyptian warships clashing with strange warriors in horned helmets and feathered headdresses. Ramses III boasts of his victory over them, claiming that he repelled their fleets and saved Egypt from their onslaught. But even in victory, the pharaoh's words reveal the scale of the crisis. They came from the midst of the sea. No land could stand before their arms. By the time they reached Egypt, the Sea Peoples had already devastated much of the ancient world. But who were they? Historians have debated this question for centuries, and no single answer has ever fully satisfied. Some theories suggest they were displaced warriors from the Aegean, possibly Mycenaeans fleeing from the destruction of their own civilization. Others believe they came from Anatolia, remnants of smaller kingdoms that had been crushed by the fall of the Hittite Empire. Another possibility is that they were not a single people at all, but rather a coalition of different groups, mercenaries, raiders, and desperate refugees, banding together in search of new lands and resources. The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. The Egyptians listed several names for these groups: the Shurden, Shekelesh, Luka, Peliset, and others. But where these names originated and what they meant is still uncertain. Some of these groups might have been mercenaries who had once served in the armies of the Great Bronze Age kingdoms, but turned against their former masters when the economy collapsed. Others may have been entire communities displaced by famine or war, seeking new lands to settle. One of the most famous cities destroyed by the Sea Peoples was Ugarit. A desperate letter from its last king, Amurapi, paints a grim picture of its final days. He pleads with the king of Al-Ashir, modern-day Cyprus, for military aid, warning that enemy ships had been sighted off the coast. The letter was never answered. Ugarit was wiped from the map, its once thriving markets silenced, its libraries buried under layers of ash. When archaeologists uncovered its ruins, they found records of last-minute attempts to fortify the city, but it had not been enough. But the Sea Peoples alone could not have caused the complete collapse of an entire era. No army, no matter how fearsome, could single-handedly bring down the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Canaanites, and Babylonians all at once. They were not the cause, but the consequence. An opportunistic force that capitalized on a world already in decline. A world weakened by something far more insidious than war. Because even as the cities burned and the palaces fell, an invisible enemy had already begun its work. One that no army, no chariot, no king could stand against. The land itself had turned against them. While the ships of the Sea Peoples swept across the Mediterranean, another disaster was unfolding, one that could not be fought with swords or shields. It did not come from invading armies or political conspiracies, nor from the ambitions of rival kings. It came from the sky, from the soil, from the very elements that had once sustained these civilizations. For decades leading up to the collapse, something strange was happening to the climate. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, rainfall patterns changed in a way that was unprecedented. Archaeological and geological studies have revealed clear evidence of prolonged droughts during this period. Lakebed sediment analysis, pollen records, and ice core data all point to the same conclusion. The world was getting drier, and the crops that had once fed these great civilizations were failing. For an agrarian society, few things are more devastating than a prolonged drought. Fields that had once provided grain for entire kingdoms yielded nothing but dust. Harvest shrank and famine spread. In cities that had grown dependent on complex irrigation systems, the failure of water supplies meant total disaster. Starvation weakened the people, and with it their faith in their rulers. Revolts began to spread as those who once trusted their kings turned against them, demanding answers, demanding food, demanding survival. But drought alone was not the only natural catastrophe to strike during this time. The region is also prone to earthquakes, and there is strong evidence that a series of devastating seismic events may have compounded the crisis. The eastern Mediterranean sits on multiple fault lines, and around the time of the collapse, major cities, including Mycenae, Troy, and others, show signs of significant earthquake damage. Buildings that had stood for centuries were suddenly reduced to rubble. Walls meant to keep invaders out crumbled under the weight of the shaking earth. Temples and palaces, symbols of power and divine favor, collapsed in an instant. And then there were the storms. Some historians and climatologists believe that volcanic eruptions, possibly from the Thera volcano on the island of Santorini, played a role in shifting weather patterns. The eruption of Thera, one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history, occurred centuries earlier, but its after-effects, ash clouds, climate shifts, disruptions in oceanic currents, may have had lingering consequences. It is also possible that another smaller eruption during the later Bronze Age further disrupted weather patterns, exacerbating the ongoing droughts. The impact of these environmental disasters was not just felt in the fields, but in the very structure of society. Food shortages led to famine, famine led to desperation, and desperation led to unrest. Rulers who could not provide for their people lost legitimacy. Cities that had once been economic and political centers became unstable, their populations either turning against their rulers or fleeing in search of better lands. For the people of the late Bronze Age, these disasters must have felt like divine punishment. What else could explain the sudden failure of the land, the crumbling of great cities, the vanishing of the trade networks that had once ensured prosperity? But the truth was far more brutal. This was not the wrath of the god. It was the fragility of a system that had been built on the assumption that stability would last forever. When the harvests failed, when the earthquakes struck, when the skies brought no rain, the people did not turn to their rulers for guidance. They turned against them. The foundations of these once great civilizations were crumbling, and the collapse was no longer just a matter of failing crops or burned cities. It had become something even more dangerous, an unraveling of social order itself. Famine breeds desperation, and desperation breeds unrest. And when the people lose faith in their rulers, no walls, no armies, no laws can hold back the tide of chaos. The greatest empires of the late Bronze Age were no longer just fighting invaders or natural disasters. They were now fighting their own people. And in the end, it would not be the sea peoples, nor the droughts, nor the earthquakes that struck the final blow. It would be the failure of the very systems that had once made these civilizations strong. Because when the leaders of the Bronze Age could no longer protect their people, the people decided they would no longer be led. And that is when civilization itself began to collapse from within. A civilization is only as strong as the belief its people have in it. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age, Mycenae, Hatti, Babylon, and Egypt, had thrived for centuries because their rulers commanded not only military strength but also the loyalty of their people. The pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Mycenae, the emperors of Hatti, and the rulers of Babylon maintained power through a delicate balance of authority, divine right, and economic stability. Their palaces were not just homes for rulers. They were administrative centers that controlled vast networks of agriculture, taxation, and military organization. But when the systems that had sustained them, trade, agriculture, and military dominance, began to fail, that balance shattered. And once faith in leadership was lost, civilization itself unraveled from within. The first signs of political decay can be seen in the desperate correspondence of rulers during the final years of the late Bronze Age. The so-called Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic messages exchanged between Egyptian pharaohs and other Near Eastern rulers, reveal growing instability decades before the collapse. kings pleaded for military aid, complained about disloyal vassals, and accused one another of breaking treaties. These letters suggest a world where rulers were already struggling to maintain control even before the worst of the crisis hit. As famine spread due to failing harvests, food riots erupted. The once mighty palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes had been centers of centralized control, where scribes recorded every aspect of the kingdom's grain stores and supply chains on tablets written in Linear B. But when those storehouses ran dry, when the scribes had nothing left to tally, those palaces no longer served their purpose. And without the ability to feed their people, the Mycenaean kings faced a rebellion they could not suppress. The great citadel of Pylos was burned to the ground, and the destruction was so sudden that half-baked clay tablets from the city's archives were found hardened by the fire, records of an administration that ceased to exist in a single night. Babylon faced similar chaos. The once mighty city had withstood centuries of conflict and political upheaval, but in the late 12th century BCE, the Cascade dynasty, which had ruled Babylon for more than 400 years, was overthrown. The invaders who took control of the city, likely the Elamites, capitalized on the weakness of Babylon's rulers, but the cracks had already been forming from within. The stability that had once made the city a beacon of civilization was gone, replaced by uncertainty and lawlessness. The Hittite Empire, which had once stretched across Anatolia and into the Levant, suffered not just from war but from internal division. Letters discovered in the ruins of Hattusa indicate that the empire's kings had been desperately trying to hold their vassal states together in the years leading up to the collapse. But famine had pushed many regions into open revolt. Some Hittite cities declared their independence, refusing to send tribute to the central government. Others were abandoned entirely, their populations fleeing before they could be consumed by starvation or invasion. When Hattusa itself finally fell, it was left in such complete ruin that even its name was forgotten for over 1,000 years. But it wasn't just the kings who lost control. It was the very concept of civilization itself. The economies of these great kingdoms had been built on long-distance trade, on vast bureaucracies that organized everything from taxation to military campaigns. When these systems broke down, cities became isolated, and with that isolation came desperation. The writing systems that had recorded treaties, laws, and royal decrees disappeared. When Linear B vanished from Greece, when the scribes of Babylon and the Hittite Empire no longer recorded royal decrees, so too did the ability to govern effectively. The world had become smaller, fragmented into isolated villages and city-states struggling to survive. The collapse of government meant the collapse of law and order, yet there was still one final blow left to fall. Because while the kingdoms of the Bronze Age had been fighting against invaders, famine, and rebellion, they had yet to face the last stage of collapse. The total destruction of their cities, the final erasure of everything they had built. One by one, the great cities of the late Bronze Age were wiped off the map. Some were burned to the ground, their once imposing palaces left in smouldering ruins. Others were simply abandoned, their people disappearing into the hills and forests, never to return. And the collapse was not contained to one region. It stretched from Greece to Mesopotamia, from Anatolia to the Levant. It was, as historian Robert Drews described, the end of a world. Mycenae, the seat of power in Bronze Age Greece, had stood for centuries as an indomitable fortress. Its great walls, later attributed to the work of giants by the Greeks, had withstood invasions before. But when the collapse came, they were not enough. The palace was destroyed and the city never recovered. By the time classical Greece emerged centuries later, its people had no memory of the kings who had once ruled there. The city of Troy, famous for the war immortalized in Homer's Iliad, also fell during this period. Archaeological evidence from Troy, that one of the successive layers of settlement at the site, suggests that it was violently destroyed around the same time as the other major centers of the Aegean. Whether it was sacked by Mycenaean raiders, by the Sea Peoples, or by internal conflict remains unclear. What is certain is that it did not survive the collapse. In the Near East, the trade city of Ugarit was obliterated so completely that it remained lost for millennia. Its final days are preserved in a series of desperate letters from its last king, Hammurapi, pleading for aid as enemy forces approached. The destruction was so rapid that scribes did not even have time to send their messages before the city fell. The once thriving streets of Ugarit, filled with merchants from across the Mediterranean, were left buried under layers of ash and rubble. The Hittite capital of Hattusa met a similar fate. When archaeologists finally uncovered the site in the 20th century, they found its great fortifications toppled, its royal archives burned. The Hittites had ruled Anatolia for centuries, but their empire had been erased so thoroughly that for much of history no one even remembered they had existed. The impact of this destruction went beyond individual cities. The loss of these great centers meant the loss of knowledge, of craftsmanship, of the very technologies that had sustained civilization. Linear B, the writing system of the Mycenaeans, disappeared completely, plunging Greece into centuries of illiteracy. Cuneiform, once the script of kings and diplomats, was used less and less as the empires that had depended on it no longer existed. The economic networks that had connected the Mediterranean collapsed entirely, leaving behind isolated communities that struggled to survive. And then there was Egypt. Of all the great Bronze Age civilizations, it was the only one to survive, but it was not untouched. The Egyptian Empire lost its hold over Canaan, retreating to the Nile as it fought off the Sea Peoples. The wealth and power that had defined Egypt's dominance faded, and though the pharaohs still ruled, their influence was a shadow of what it had once been. In the space of a century, civilization itself had reset. The world that had been built over 1,000 years, the world of Mycenae, Ugarit, Hattusa, and Babylon, was gone. The great kingdoms of the past had fallen, and in their place new societies would slowly begin to rise. But the age of grand palaces, vast empires, and mighty chariot armies was over. The world had entered a dark age, and those who emerged from the ashes would have to start anew, forging a future not with bronze, but with a new material that would define the next era of human history: iron. Yet even as new civilizations rose from the ruins, the question remains, how had it come to this? Could such a catastrophe happen again? Or was this collapse a unique event, a tragedy confined to the distant past? History tells us otherwise, and because the greatest lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is not just how it happened, but that it could happen again. The Bronze Age was over. The mighty empires that had ruled for centuries were gone, their capitals reduced to ruins, their trade networks shattered. Cities that had once been hubs of wealth and power had been abandoned or destroyed. Writing, which had recorded the laws and histories of these civilizations, disappeared in many places. The world had changed forever, but history does not stop with collapse. It continues, reshaped by those who survive. And from the wreckage of the Bronze Age, a new world emerged. It was a world of smaller kingdoms, fragmented societies, and new technologies. The transition was not immediate, nor was it easy. It would take centuries for civilization to fully recover, but the foundations of a new era, the Iron Age, were beginning to form. Egypt was the only great Bronze Age power to endure, but it was no longer the empire it had once been. The pharaohs, once rulers of a vast domain stretching from the Nile to the Levant, found themselves retreating inward. Their hold over Canaan was lost, their armies no longer as dominant as they had been in the past. The inscriptions of Ramses III, who had fought off the Sea Peoples, speak of victory, but the reality was one of survival, not triumph. Egypt would never again be the supreme power of the region. In Mesopotamia, the collapse of the Cascade dynasty in Babylon left a power vacuum. The city, once the heart of an empire, fell under the control of foreign rulers. Yet, in the coming centuries, new powers would rise. The Assyrians, who had once been minor players in the late Bronze Age, adapted and grew stronger. Unlike their predecessors, they learned to harness the power of iron, forging weapons that were stronger and more durable than anything bronze had produced. Their disciplined armies and ruthless tactics would soon make them the dominant force in the Near East. To the west, The Phoenicians, whose cities had miraculously escaped the worst of the collapse, began to thrive in the New World. While land-based trade routes had disintegrated, the sea remained open, and the Phoenicians mastered it. Their ships traveled further than any civilization before them, spreading goods, ideas, and, perhaps most importantly, the alphabet. The writing systems of the Bronze Age had been complex, used only by elite scribes, but the Phoenicians developed a simpler, more adaptable script, one that would later evolve into the alphabets used by Greece, Rome, and eventually the modern world. In Greece, the once mighty Mycenaean civilization was gone. Its palaces were abandoned, its people scattered. For centuries after the collapse, Greece entered a true dark age. Literacy disappeared entirely, and the great architectural and artistic traditions of the Mycenaeans vanished. Small, isolated communities replaced the centralized kingdoms that had once ruled the region. It would be centuries before Greece recovered, but when it did, it would give rise to a new kind of civilization, one that would define the Western world. The shift from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was not simply about technology, it was about adaptation. Bronze had been the metal of kings and elites, requiring complex trade routes to acquire tin and copper. Iron, by contrast, was abundant. It was difficult to work with at first, but once civilizations mastered iron smelting, they could produce tools and weapons more efficiently than ever before. This new technology allowed smaller, previously insignificant states to challenge the old powers. The world was no longer dominated by a handful of superpowers. The future belonged to those who could adapt. The collapse had changed the rules. The grand empires of the late Bronze Age, with their vast bureaucracies and elaborate trade networks, had been fragile. They had relied too much on stability, on the assumption that their way of life would continue forever. When that assumption proved false, they crumbled. But in the wake of their destruction, new ways of ruling, fighting, and surviving emerged. The Iron Age had begun. The forces that brought down the great civilizations of the late Bronze Age are not so different from the challenges we face today. Economic collapse, climate change, political instability, mass migration, and the breakdown of long-distance trade networks were all factors that contributed to their downfall, each one feeding into the next, creating a cycle of decline that could not be stopped. Today, in an era of unprecedented technological progress and global connectivity, we too rely on fragile systems. Supply chains, financial networks, and political structures that depend on stability. The rulers of the Bronze Age likely believed their world would endure forever. They had built walls around their cities, gathered armies, and secured alliances. They could not imagine a world where their palaces stood empty, their economies disintegrated, and their writing systems were forgotten. And yet that world came to pass. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of humanity, but it was the end of a world built on assumptions of stability, assumptions that proved to be illusions. In its place, new civilizations emerged, learning from the past, adapting to new realities, and forging new futures. The question is not whether collapse is possible. The question is whether we will learn from history before history repeats itself.